There's been a lot of talk in the media lately of something called fog of war. And if you're a gamer like myself, you think, I know what the fog of war is. It's that little, black and gray area on my battle maps that I can't access until I move a unit there. And while that's true for games, the fog of war means something completely different in real life because as we all know, there is not this mysterious fog where none of us can see into what's happening in a war zone except the people who are specifically there. That's not really how it works. What is meant by fog of war is the amount of misinformation, disinformation, accidental, um, you know, whoopsie daisies, I guess, made when talking about a war, right? And this also has to do with the amount of information that is artificially changed, either on purpose or by accident. And also, it has to do with partially like the video game sense, right? So, because war zones are so dangerous, it's often very difficult for independent reporting to actually come out from a war zone, or it to be documented in a war zone exactly, what the casualties are, taking what and whatever, because war zones are so dangerous and sending people there is often difficult and dangerous. And although there are many great reporters who do really great work, and there are amazing and heroic war reporters who go into war zones and actually do real live war reporting, there aren't a ton of them. And there certainly aren't enough to cover whole wars at once, right? So the information that people get from war typically comes from the warring sides, right? And that information is difficult to trust for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the problem of independent verification. But also, wars aren't just won on the battlefield, and they haven't been for a really long time. Wars are also about money and propaganda and national sentiment and things like that, right? For most countries, in order to fight a war, you have to have physical and political resources. And so I think I've talked on the show before about political capital. But essentially, for those of you who haven't seen that segment, political capital is essentially how much political will you of the people of your nation you can leverage before you essentially run out of momentum, right? So typically when people get elected, they have momentum, they've been running on things, they have a mandate, right? That mandate is people having voted them into office, or putting them into office in some other way. And with here to do some things, go do them, we assent to your doing these things, right? So that's political capital. So if you're fighting a war, you have only so much capital that you can expend before the war either becomes unpopular or before people start to think about ways to get rid of you because the war isn't going the way it's supposed to, or there's pressure to end the war, right? And so a great example of that is the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the wars were pretty popular at first, in both government and outside of government. As many of you will recall, Barbara Lee was the only person in the entire House and U.S. House and U.S. Senate to vote against the Iraq War. So there was a real fervor in the country for war, right? And that had been because of 9/11, right? We had been attacked. There was a need. There was a feeling in the country, and so you create a war, and that was our doing something. Now, the war eventually got unpopular, but it didn't get that way right away. And part of that was because Bush and the people who were around Bush had the political capital of, hey, we just got attacked, we have to attack someone else, right? So political capital can be generated in lots of different ways, but you only have so much of it. It's not infinite. And eventually, regardless of what you do, you will run out of political capital. And once you run out of political capital, it becomes very difficult to do much of anything. Okay, so going back, financial resources and political resources, right? So we just talked about political resources. And of course, financial resources are pretty self explanatory. And by the way, one of the reasons that many countries are trying to hurt Russia's economy is from having any level of financial resources to fight their war with right now, right? Um, Putin doesn't have a ton of political resources either, but he is not as accountable to the people as many other leaders in the world are. So he actually doesn't have to worry too much about political will for the most part, right? But if the people who are around him, the billionaires and the oligarchs and things, want to get rid of him, like he has capital with them too, right? So eventually that political capital may run out. So all that being said, part of the way that political is through the use of propaganda and the discussion of the war from a positive perspective, right? So, for example, in Ukraine, there has been a ton of very heroic defensive actions, and every time there is one of the Ukrainian government and its media apparatus, for what it's worth, is going to, prop those up and make a big hoopla about all the things that Ukrainians are doing to resist the Russians, right? Because that keeps the national morale high. It buys Zelensky additional political resources to do things that he is doing, including, by the way, the recent banning of 11 allegedly Russia-related political parties. I have not verified personally, and I've not seen verification that they're all Russia-related. But Zelensky might not have been able to do that if he had no additional political capital, right? So some of this political capital is generated by propaganda, and on the other side too, the Russians are going to generate political propaganda in order to bolster their political capital, both at home and abroad. And so, because both sides are, maybe stretching the truth a little bit and trying to portray what's going on, that information that's coming from them helps to create the fog of war, because no one's really telling the whole objective truth. Now, just quick aside here, it's almost impossible to get the whole objective truth about anything, but in these situations specifically, right, especially when there are active efforts to create positive narratives for either side, Russia is almost never going to talk about Russian casualties. Ukraine is almost never going to talk about Ukrainian casualties. Or if they do talk about them, since it's a defensive war, they may exaggerate what happened. I'm not saying that they are necessarily doing that. I'm not accusing anyone of anything particularly, but the incentive is there to, especially because Ukraine is asking the international community for as much help as possible, to, as often as possible, exaggerate either their victories in order to try and get the Russians to pull out, or their losses in order to get the world to feel sorry for them and to give them more resources, right? So because of this, and added to how difficult it is to confirm anything in war, this is kind of what the fog of war is. This is how fog of war is generated. So the reason I'm bringing this up, and why it's important to you, is because you will start to see lots of information coming out of the Russia-Ukraine war, and out of Ukraine specifically, about how things are going and about what cities have fallen, and what areas are controlled by whom, and what things have been done, and who's died and who hasn't died, and whatever, and what assassination attempts have been made, and yada yada yada. All I'm saying is, every time you see something like that, just make sure that that information is not just coming from the Russian government or military or the Ukrainian government or military, because that information is likely being altered, not maliciously, but in order to make people feel better about what's going on there, right? So it's important to make sure that any information that you're getting is independently verified. And if you do receive information that is independently verified, it's okay to trust that, because typically what that means is that another news source, oftentimes without connection to either side, has gone and looked in and said, hey, we've seen the same thing that's being said by such and such a party. And then that's usually believable. But in absence of that, you really shouldn't believe anything that's coming out of the war. And this is going to make it very difficult to figure out exactly what's going on. But that's kind of the point of a war, right? Is that it's very difficult to ascertain the truth of what's going on. And, we need to have a continued skepticism about all parties in a war, because those parties want specific things from the people to whom they're conveying information, right? So, anyway, once again, be skeptical of information you see coming out about the war. Be skeptical pretty much of all information unless it can be independently verified. It's important for us as people who, um, consume media, whether we are media presenters ourselves, like me, or whether you're just a regular consumer of media, like potentially you, to make sure that the information that we are consuming and giving to other people is as accurate as possible, because that information informs our choices, whether they're political choices or whatever. So, once again, just be skeptical. Keep in mind that the information coming out of the war zone is likely being tugged in one direction or the other, and just generally just be skeptical of media and reporting in general.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.